Are you interested to know how Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon and how we can know? Then this series is for you. I'm going to do an in-depth with regard to the Book of Mormon and how it links to Joseph and how we can tell that Joseph is creating it in his moment of oration. One of the things that makes Joseph so fascinating is that he was pretty much a nobody when the Book of Mormon was published in March of 1830. Producing a book of over 500 pages when he pretty much had not written a sentence prior seems to be incredible, and it's captured the imagination of people worldwide. All that we know about Joseph Smith's early life comes from after the Book of Mormon's publishing and people being very interested in him and being able to explain him because of their previous experience with him. There are a few resources that are really helpful for this, and primarily there's the early Mormon documents created by Dan Vogel back in 1996. There's 5 volumes and you can access them free on the Internet Archive, and they provide a rich understanding of excerpts of people and testimony, generally of people who knew Joseph or papers that published about him around the time of the Book of Mormon. These offer some compelling insights into his life when he himself was probably too poor to be able to afford ink and paper, and therefore there's not a lot written about him prior to this time. And certainly he never wrote anything down, so there's just so little about him from his own words prior to 1829. Another great resource is the Joseph Smith's papers, and these are all available online as well and provide some rich understanding of Joseph Smith during his whole life, but also some reminiscence from others, and particularly histories that he created and that others created, and particularly his mother. This provides some clues that we can piece together some of the events that happened in Joseph's life and how he was developing as a young man and looking towards this project of the Book of Mormon. So join me as we dive deep. You can ask questions, which I'll try to answer along the way, as well as giving some really big insights into how the Book of Mormon is composed, what it's composed of, and how it got transmitted into a physical form. By far the biggest resource we have about Joseph's early life is the history that his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, publishes in 1845. You can go and read this for free on the Joseph Smith Papers project. There is also a 1844 draft that you can look at, and they're pretty close, but there are some discrepancies which are really interesting. But it gives you a great overview of the Smith family and their adventures, their move from New England through to Western New York, some of the things that have been a part of their family legacy. It's just an all-around good read. Lucy Mack spends a great deal of time talking about the history of the Smiths and the Macks so that you understand who they are and where they've come from. The Smiths' entry into the Americas is back as far as the mid-17th century. They are of multi-generational American stock. Both Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr.'s dads fought in the Revolutionary War. And so they were heavily patriotic and really embroiled in that New England understanding of independence. Both the Macks and the Smiths were well-to-do farming families who had plenty. And in fact, Lucy Mack talks about her brothers giving her an inheritance when she married of $1,000, which was a massive start to the new family. But she also talks about how Joseph Smith Sr. was swindled out of his ginseng export business and how this money needed to pay debts. And so they fell from this really privileged situation through to a great deal of poverty. And from then on, they bounced from farm to farm, family to family, trying to get a foothold, but disease and poor crops meant that they really just lived just above the poverty line and sometimes were quite destitute. After a volcanic eruption meant that there was no summer in New England and crops failed repeatedly, the family were warned out and had to move. Joseph Smith Sr. went on ahead to Palmyra and then called for Lucy and the kids to follow. In leaving, they were stripped of their wealth and basically got to Palmyra penniless. They got some benefit from the economic boom that was connected to the Erie Canal construction, and they were able to get a little parcel of land nearby Palmyra, which they then cleared for farming. The oldest boy, Alvin, was particularly helpful. When Joseph Smith Sr. started to become a bit unreliable, Alvin took it in his charge to provide for the family and pay the mortgage on the land. But when Alvin died suddenly in 1823, this thrust the family into economic and religious turmoil. Joseph Smith Sr. turned to more speculative ways to provide for the family, including treasure digging, in which he took young Joseph with him. It was on one of these trips away from home that the mortgage was foreclosed, and Lucy, with Hiram Smith, the son, managed to broker a deal to become tenants on the farm that they previously owned. Sliding down the economic ladder caused more and more desperation. One of Joseph's motivations was to help the family, particularly the older parents, to survive this economic downturn, and for the younger children, because there's many kids in the Smith family, to be able to be provided for. And this is why Joseph Smith didn't write anything down, because ink and paper were expensive and there was something that he just didn't have much access to. But there is really good indication that Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. were really passionate about providing some form of education, even if it was just from their own home, to their children. Joseph Smith Sr. had been a school teacher during part of his life, and Lucy Mack, who went on to write a book, talked about her family in glowing terms, particularly her own father, who wrote a book, and Joseph Smith Sr.'s father, who was really close to literature and threw things at them to read as a family. Joseph Smith Jr. obviously had quite a rough life in terms of solid education, but he absolutely was very proficient in a number of things, including debating and memorization, and he was incredibly clever when it came to treasure digging, because many of the people around him talked very openly about how special he was and how he could see and help others see in their mind's eye things that were going on below the surface of the earth. But such issues like poverty, homelessness, treasure seeking, economic problems, these are really big issues for Joseph. They're also really big themes in the Book of Mormon. Religious conflict is also a big deal as well, because this is all happening in the backdrop of the Second Great Awakening and a number of revivals in Western New York, talking about God and its necessity in people's lives. Lucy Mack was from a Calvinist background, and Joseph Smith Sr. was from a Universalist background. And so when Alvin died, Lucy Mack felt really like she needed religion in her life and joined with the Presbyterians, along with Hiram and Sophronia and also Samuel. This split the family religiously and caused a number of conflicts between the parents. And these issues also come up in the Book of Mormon repeatedly, because they're the kinds of things that were going on in families all throughout Western New York, where these kinds of understandings about religion and their place in people's homes were going on. Lucy Mack, in her biography, talks about Joseph Smith Jr. and how close he was to the Bible, the ways that he would learn and separate himself from religion to side with his father. And this tension between the folk magic that was embodied in treasure seeking and the Christianity that was embodied in organized religions, particularly in Palmyra and in the surrounding areas are also a big facet of the ways that Joseph Smith came to his understanding of God. And while Joseph never recorded any of the stuff prior to the Book of Mormon, we see these echoes in the Book of Mormon, and then we see him talk about them in his histories in 1832 and in 1838. And we also get an understanding from some of the ways that Oliver Cowdery talks about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon and the early church in his letters of 1834 and 1835. So we'll piece all of this together as we talk more about these issues and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. One of the important dynamics to understand about the Smiths is that early 19th century America, they are part of a community. They have neighbors, they have friends, and they have extended family. The Smiths had immigrated from Vermont to Western New York as economic refugees, but they still had family who were well-to-do that they communicated with regularly. Joseph Smith Sr.'s father was alive, plus his brothers, and there were communications back and forth about the Smith family. The Smiths were the poor cousins. They had lots of children. They were in desperate circumstances, and so the wider extended family were concerned about them and were worried about their circumstances. But because Joseph Smith Sr. just couldn't quite get it together, and particularly after the death of Alvin, things were terrible in the Smiths' home in Palmyra in New York. But the communication between the other Smiths suggested a bit of disdain and the idea that they weren't performing very well. Now, not a lot of this has survived, so we don't have huge amounts to call on, but we at least have one really important letter in June of 1829 from Jesse Smith, one of the oldest brothers and the kind of patriarch of the family, particularly as the grandfather, Azel Smith, was ailing. This letter, which was copied into the letter book of the church, has managed to preserve it so that we can read it today. You can go find it on the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and it is a scathing letter from Uncle Jesse during the production of the Book of Mormon in June of 1829. I'm going to produce it here so that you can stop the video and read, because it's a thoroughly great read. Uncle Jesse Smith was Joseph's favorite uncle. In fact, when Joseph had his leg surgery, Uncle Jesse took Joseph to the seaside to convalesce. But in this letter, Uncle Jesse is writing to Hiram Smith, Joseph's older brother, and giving a scathing understanding of the project around the Book of Mormon. And you can hear Uncle Jesse's disdain for the family and the ways that they are not measuring up to the Smith family name. He talks about them creating a golden calf with the idea of these golden plates that Joseph is translating. He suggests that this gold book, discovered by necromancy and infidelity and dug from the mines of atheism, and that the idea that this angel of the Lord is more of a devil. That he believes that the Smiths are making up this story in order to have some kind of dominion over the people of Palmyra. He says that Uncle Jesse did and still does think this whole pretended discovery not a very deep but a very clear and foolish deception, a very great wickedness. He goes on to call them blasphemers because they're suggesting that God is doing this, and if they're doing anything wrong, it's because God is deceiving them. And he accuses them of using the Lord's name in vain because they are invoking him against this great evil which they're perpetuating against their neighbors. And he really chastises them that they're going away to some everlasting punishment because of this great crime they're committing. Uncle Jesse also references a number of letters that are going back and forth with some of the Smith brothers and the grandfather. And so there's a number of letters that are going on, but this is the only letter that we have existent of this particular discussion of the family, wider family, and their understanding of the Book of Mormon. But Uncle Jesse suggests that this is causing the family a lot of angst, particularly the grandfather. And although the letter is written to Hiram Smith, Jesse is really going at it against his younger brother, Joseph Smith Sr. Jesse also takes his younger brother to task over the idea that he has a wand or rod like Janus and Jambres, that he's a magician like that magician in the courts of Moses in Egypt. So he's well aware that his younger brother is participating in folk magic and using a rod, and that this is also the thing that Joseph is doing with a seer stone. And Jesse mocks his younger brother that if he could just get the spectacles from his son that he was using to decipher hieroglyphics, that he could then be able to write a letter to his brother rather than having this nervous condition that requires his son Hiram to write on his behalf. Jesse also suggests that he might come to visit, but that his visit might not be welcome because of his strong feelings against what the Smiths are doing in Palmyra with this golden book. This scathing letter from Jesse Smith to the family is just something that would have affected them so much, because they really want to make the family name proud. When I was talking earlier about Lucy Mack and her kind of detailing of the Smith family and their legacy, this idea that Joseph Smith was tainting the family's name is a really big deal, and they would have had huge embarrassment over this. And yet they're doing the Book of Mormon, and they want it to be special, and they want it to redeem them in the eyes of their neighborhood, but also particularly their extended family. Embarrassment is a huge motivator. And I think one of the things we see with this letter in June of 1829, when Joseph and Oliver are at the Whitmer farm in Fayette, New York, and probably getting to read these letters because now they've moved from Harmony, Joseph is incredibly affected by what he's reading and the disdain that the wider family are having for him in this project. And I think that manifests in the Book of Mormon, because we see the authors in the Book of Mormon pivot in their response. They talk directly to the reader in a second person narrative, and they also offer a number of excuses for the fact that it's not perfect, that they seem to talk about the kinds of criticisms that Jesse is bringing up in this letter and other letters perhaps they're getting as well. The ideas are now making their way into the text of the Book of Mormon, particularly with the prophets Mormon, Moroni, and then in the replacement text with Nephi and Jacob. So Uncle Jesse's letter in June of 1829 is a fascinating document and gives us an incredible insight into the Smith family extended dynamics that are playing into the ways that the Book of Mormon come forth. Nick brings up a really important point about some of the dynamics in the Smith household, which I think is worthy of some expansion. He writes, "I thought it was interesting when I was reading Lucy Mack Smith's manuscript that she makes Joseph Smith Sr. out to be a kind of useless coward, and how it's always up to her to save the family." It is true, when Lucy is relaying her memoir, Joseph Smith Jr. has just recently died, and also Joseph Smith Sr. died about 5 years earlier, and she's able to reframe the understanding of the family with her as a bit of a hero. She tells about how her textile work keeps the family afloat when the rest of the boys and Joseph Smith Sr. are working on the land to turn it into some productive farm. She also tells of an experience when Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. are away, presumably in Harmony, Pennsylvania, on a treasure dig, that the creditors come to foreclose on the land, and she has to broker a deal with a local guy called Lemuel Durfee to be able to basically purchase the property on her behalf, making her a tenant. This is done in conjunction with Hiram, who, because he's a man, gets to be the signer on these deeds. But Lucy, in the background, directing her son, is the brains behind the operation. This event is portrayed in the Book of Mormon with the idea of King Lemhi and his advisor Gideon. Wicked King Noah has lost the kingdom. He's been investing in things which haven't brought the kingdom safety or prosperity, and the Lamanites have come in and basically taken over. Limhi throws himself at the mercy of King Laman, who then determines that he will be a tributary king, basically a tenant on the land, and give a huge amount of taxation in order to remain. Gideon is the advisor who makes this peace possible, but then also provides a way for them to be able to escape the clutches of the Lamanites. If any of you are interested, I did a whole podcast on Mormonish about this, the idea that Mosiah, or the Book of Mosiah, and the idea of the kings really shows the development of Joseph Smith's family under the direction of Alvin, then Joseph Smith Sr., and then Hiram Smith. It's episode 168 and called Mosiah and Joseph Smith, an autobiographical journey. We get another insight into Lucy Mack Smith and her relationship with Joseph Smith Sr. from the beginning of the Book of Mormon in the account of Nephi. Nephi describes his father Lehi as a visionary man and his mother Sariah as a faithless complainer because she doesn't see the kinds of things that he sees, and the idea that leading them out from their homeland to a new area will bring them a great deal of success. One of the areas that I think Joseph is resentful of his mother is that she broke with her father, Joseph Smith Sr., and joined the Presbyterians when Alvin had died. And this was a religious break in the family that really put this family at odds on religious matters. Many women in the Second Great Awakening were called to lead their families in spiritual righteousness by joining themselves to churches, and this is what Lucy Mack did for her family, especially after Alvin's death, and worries about salvation. But this split the Smith family and caused a great division on religious grounds, which the Book of Mormon really sought to unite the whole family, but also people in general, on the idea that there should be no disputations among them over religious and Christian ideas. So some of these Smith family dynamics are the basis for a number of specific stories in the Book of Mormon, ones that gave an insight to the ways that particularly the parents were connecting with each other, but also some of the children and how they are connecting to their parents. One of the things that is incredibly significant and really important to know about Joseph Smith is his culture. Joseph is a New England refugee in Western New York. And as part of that subculture, he is also incredibly involved in folk magic. Joseph Smith Sr. relays that he has been involved in folk magic since at least Joseph's birth. And Joseph has grown up with this completely in his environment. I cannot overemphasize how important this is. You know, if you go to another country and you immerse yourself in the culture, sometimes it's really important to understand the values that are going on for the people that you're visiting. And that once you understand that, you can understand their motivations, you can understand what things are important to them, you can understand how they view the world, the kinds of things they're striving for, and this has a huge impact on the kind of relationship you can have with them. The first 50 to 100 members of the church in Western New York were from this folk magic culture. They were often New England refugees in Western New York, just like Joseph Smith, and they understood and came from a similar background that gave them a common understanding. And there is a lot of information about this once you start to look. In fact, there's 6 independent understandings of Joseph and his folk magic connections that are really important to consider. We have Lucy Mack's biography in 1845, which talks about some of these things in the Smith home. We have Emma's family in Harmony, Pennsylvania, talking about Joseph Smith and the ways that he enacted folk magic in that area. We have affidavits from Joseph Smith's neighbours in Palmyra and Manchester. We have court records and testimony of Joseph Smith's 1826 trial, in which he was convicted of his folk magic practice. We have information from his folk magic friends, Josiah Stoll and Joseph Knight Sr., who also talked about their involvement in this culture. And lastly, we have the Book of Mormon itself, which talks about a number of these folk magic practices and artifacts that make its way into the text. And we have some artifacts from this period. We have the Smith family parchments that are part of the Jerusalem scrolls. I'm also wearing one as part of my t-shirt. And we have a seer stone. This is the brown seer stone that was used to produce the Book of Mormon. That's also an artifact of the folk magic world. There are some great resources. This is Joseph Smith and the Beginning of Mormonism, done by Richard Bushman in 1984, which gives a really good account of the Smith family's beginnings and their inclusion into folk magic culture. It's the forerunner to Rough Stone Rolling, which was published in 2005, but I think this gives a much more accurate and more grounded understanding of the Smith family. Michael Quinn wrote Early Mormonism and the Magic World View. That was published in 1987, and this gives an incredibly rich understanding of some of the Smith family folk magic practices. And I particularly like Mark Elwood's graphic novels that really bring these kinds of things to life. He does an incredible job of detailing some of the stories around folk magic with regard to Joseph, and also brings it to life with pictures so that you can understand that this is quite an adventure that Joseph is embarking on. And in my book, I have 5 chapters on folk magic that are really drilling down into the understandings of what is going on for Joseph and how is folk magic underpinning the beginnings of his understanding of God and his view of the world. So we're going to delve into this culture quite a bit just to understand what is going on for the Smith family and how this is working with regard to the bringing forth of the Book of Mormon. Many of you will recognize this man, Benjamin Franklin, as a founding father of the American independence. He was also a prominent New Englander who often spoke about the culture and what was happening to the people around him. Benjamin Franklin was part of the Enlightenment and an understanding that you could use reason to determine what was going on, and this is the basis and the foundation for the American Republic. He also made it his mission to speak up against superstition. He was keen for an America that was rational and thinking and made great decisions. But America was also underpinned by religion, and this often meant that people had some quite spurious beliefs. So trying to dissect them and get some form of belief in God apart from superstition was a really big thing in early 18th century America and also through into the early 19th century. A significant pastime in New England was digging for treasure because coastal pirates had hid their loot up and down the coast. This underpinned folk magic because it was the belief that you could use spells and witchcraft and artifice to find some mechanism to discover these treasures in some way and break some spells that might be guarding them. Here's a couple of quotes from Benjamin Franklin that date back to 1734. This old humour of digging for money through a belief that much has been hid by pirates formerly frequenting the river has for several years been a mighty prevalent among us, insomuch that you can hardly walk half a mile out of town on any side without observing several pits dug with that design. There are among us great number of hosts of artifice and labouring people who, fed with vain hope of growing suddenly rich, neglect their business, almost to the ruining of themselves and family, and voluntarily endure abundance of fatigue in a fruitless search after imaginary hidden treasure. They wander through the woods and bushes by day to discover the marks and signs. At midnight they repair to the hopeful spot with spades and pickaxes, full of expectation. At length a mighty hole is dug, and perhaps several cartloads of earth thrown out, but alas, no keg or iron pot is found, no seaman's chest crammed with Spanish pistols or weighty pieces of eight. Then they conclude that through some mistake in the procedure, some rash word spoken, or some rule of art neglected, the guardian spirit had power to sink it deeper into the earth and convey it out of their reach. Benjamin Franklin spent a lot of time trying to get rid of this superstition attached to treasure digging in his community, but he, alas, was not that successful. These things persisted well into the 19th century. And this was particularly the case with those who were in poverty, which was also those New England refugees who fled to Western New York like the Smiths. Here, the coastal pirates were replaced with Indian artifacts because there were a ton of mounds in the Western New York, Ohio region, which had buried graves, some treasures that were related to Native American peoples. And just like hush stories of the success of coastal pirates' treasure being dug up in New England, the same thing was being reported in the papers in Western New York with regard to great finds in Indian burial mounds around the surrounding area. These stories became great fodder to explain the archaeological sites that dotted the area in the region, but they also sought to explain Native Americans who at this point were refugees themselves and were kind of a bit fallen. So there were mechanisms to explain their loss of these treasures because of some of their cursing and displeasure with God. Folk magic became a way to perceive what was going on in the area, particularly under the ground. And to perceive all of these things hidden underground, you needed a seer with a powerful seer stone. You also needed a team. You needed somebody to hold the light, the lantern in the darkness, because often these treasure digs were happening in the pitch black. And then you also needed someone to interpret the writings, the spells, the magus, the magical parchments that allowed you to capture the spirits that were keeping these treasures at bay. You needed somebody to wield the sword of protection so you could draw magic circles to trap the treasure and the guardian. And then you also needed somebody to dig. So you needed a spade. And these are the 5 areas that people would gravitate their treasure digs around. Everybody had a role, and you were purposeful in going out to construct a dig in order to secure these treasures. The Smiths were treasure diggers. Joseph would accompany his father in conjunction with a few other men and go into the hills in the dead of night to look for treasure. These were carefully curated events that had specific procedures attached to them. Each person would hold a particular item. There would be somebody who would hold a lantern because they would need light, and there would be somebody who had a shovel so that they could dig. They would carry a sword or dagger with them for protection, and they would have sacred text that would allow them to illuminate the situation with knowledge. They would also have charms of luck and protection, and they might even have an animal for sacrifice. The Smiths had a few of these magical items. They had a seer stone. This is Joseph's brown seer stone. There are also reports of other seer stones. This is his sandy seer stone. This is Joseph Smith Sr.'s Mars dagger, which he probably used to draw a magical circle. These circles were parts of the magical parchments that the Smiths had. They were sacred documents made from such spell books as the Magus and the Grimoires. They probably also had a Bible with them, because the Bible was seen to be a magical book, something that enabled the unseen world to connect with the seen world. And here is Joseph's Jupiter talisman, which gave him protection and luck. So treasure digs generally involved a seer plus 4 others. There would be a lead and then another 3 men who were important to the dig. The night was chosen through astrology for the best times to dig, depending on the wane of the moon and the other planetary movements. Solstice and equinox were also important dates. And as you go through the various accounts of Joseph Smith's neighbours and even the information that the Hales provide, you can see that there are the commonalities that are attached to treasure digging. Isaac Hale, Joseph's father-in-law, was privy to his 1825 dig with Josiah Stoll, because Isaac Hale both housed the diggers but also provided his signature on the agreement. We can tell from the agreement that there were a number of people involved in this endeavour, but Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith Jr. were key, and also with 3 other men. So this idea of a group of 5 is really prevalent through these treasure digs. Isaac Hale also explains that when Joseph started producing the Book of Mormon, he did so with the same mechanism that he had done these treasure digs, with his head buried in a hat and his stone in the hat. And this is the way that the Book of Mormon came forth. But it's also curious to note that the way that the Book of Mormon came forth was also probably to do with this idea of teams. Certainly there was a seer who had the stone, that was Joseph, who was producing the text, but then there was a scribe who was writing it down, and then there were others in the household that were either listening in or would hear the transcript later and chime in with their thoughts. And in this way, the Book of Mormon, just like a treasure dig, was a team effort. And the Book of Mormon itself talked about some of these team treasure digs. We see these in the text where people like Lehi, as a seer, sends his 4 sons out to retrieve the brass plates, and then again to go to get the daughters of Ishmael for wives. We see King Noah send out his 4 sons to do missionary work. We even see in Ether, the brother of Jared, sending out the 4 sons to cultivate the land. Joseph even does this himself before the publication of the Book of Mormon, where he sends 4 men, Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Knight Sr., Josiah Stoll, and Hiram Page, to Canada to sell the copyright. And we see him do this again in September of 1830, when he sends out Oliver Cowdery, Ziba Peterson, Parley P. Pratt, and John Whitmer to Indian Territory to identify the New Jerusalem. This idea of teams and their acquisition of treasure is a really big part of folk magic, treasure digging, and also the way that the Book of Mormon, the early church, and Joseph Smith operate in this space. It's incredibly fascinating and incredibly revealing that this is folk magic in its practical reality. Now you might ask the very rational question, why do people still invest in Joseph's treasure digging if he's not finding anything? The answer lies in the same mechanism that keeps people believing in the second coming or a rapture, but despite the fact that it never seems to happen, they still believe that it is going to, and that they invest in this very important story because it gives them a great deal of hope and superiority and a desire that things will be different. Joseph learned very early on that the story is more important than the result. People invest in stories for a number of really important reasons. One is that it binds people together. It gives people something to do, something to think about, something to talk about, but also provides a mechanism of sociality that is really important to the human condition. Stories provide entertainment, they provide education, they provide some form of enlightenment, and they also provide a huge amount of hope for the future. Lucy Mack talks about in her book how Joseph Smith would relate these grand stories about the ancient inhabitants of this continent, that he would be able to tell them the mode of their transport, their weaponry, their fights, everything about them in such great detail that they would be so engaging to the family, and that Joseph was talking like he had spent his life amongst them. These stories were the basis of treasure digging. You would go out into the woods. It would be a grand adventure where you would be with your mates. You would invest in these understandings of treasure under the ground. You would talk about spells and mystics and unseen things and ghosts. And then when the treasure would not materialize, you could explain it by these grand conspiracies of treasure guardians whisking the treasure out from underneath you under the ground. People might come back from those digs a little disheartened, but they were also greatly connected to the people that they were with. They'd had an adventure. They'd been on the cusp of realizing this great treasure, and they had been excited about their sociality with each other. This shouldn't be any great surprise, because this kind of investing in an imaginary world is a really big part of being a person. In fact, there are many ways that we do this. We imagine worlds outside of our own, including sci-fi. If you've ever done any Dungeons and Dragons, you've invested in a role-playing exercise with a group of people and a team. The idea that you are setting out on a quest, that you are invoking certain, gifts and powers, and then defeating some kind of threat. World building is a big part of being a human, because it's a way that we fantasize outside of our own lives, which may be hard and tough, but also an opportunity to engage our imagination in ways of fixing problems that might be creative. Joseph employed these skills in being a treasure digger, and this was a mechanism by which people invested in him, respected him, and bought into the worlds that he helped create and imagine alongside them. And it's the same kind of mechanism that is used in creating the Book of Mormon, imagining groups of people, military fights, camaraderie, connection, missionary work, and folding them all into a narrative that explained the Native Americans. And these were explanations that people wanted. They wanted to understand Native Americans. They wanted to understand God's dealings with these people. They wanted to understand how the American continent was part of a greater biblical worldview. And Joseph's creative storytelling that were refined on these treasure digs and that were honed in his living room as he talked to his family were now going to be the basis for an explanation of the Native Americans that became the Book of Mormon. He reimagined events that had happened to him personally, and he put it into a Christian adventure story, something that other people could respond to and that he had a great deal of heart in, and he could embellish them such that they became really synonymous with biblical stories of grandeur and miracle. He could also talk about the acquisition of this record in a way that satisfied treasure diggers in his own area. And that's something that's really important that we're going to talk about next, is the idea that some of the earliest stories about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon were much more related to a folk magic treasure-seeking environment. So in this way, it would totally appeal to similar New England refugees in Western New York, the same people who were going out on treasure digs with him in the area. One of the biggest switches that happened in the early church was that of transforming a treasure digging story into a heavenly religious experience. Many people will be aware of this particular picture of the angel Moroni appearing to Joseph in his bedroom, directing him to the idea that there are plates buried in the nearby hill in Cumorah, which he would be responsible for translating into the Book of Mormon. But when you go to the historic record, you find a few anomalies. And one of the first ones that you discover is that Moroni is not identified as the angel until the mid-1830s. Up until then, it's just identified as an unnamed angel. And when you go back even further into the 1820s, you realize that the people around Joseph don't know anything about an angel. They refer to the messenger who brings the plates as some kind of bleeding ghost. Both the Hales family and the extended Smith family accused Joseph of necromancy, which is talking to dead spirits. And some of these spirits are nefarious and not very great. One of the laws around treasure digging was that the treasures under the ground were protected by guardian spirits, victims of huge crimes when those treasures were buried. For instance, when pirates would put down their loot, they would slit the throats of one of the participants and throw him into the grave with the loot to protect it. And in this way, this haunted spirit would be connected to the treasure and make sure that it was not accessed by anybody other than its owner. So part of the treasure digging ritual was some way to entrap this guardian spirit to stop it from sinking the treasure deeper into the earth, to allow those who were trying to seek it and dig it up to access it. But these ghosts were terrifying, and the seer, who often was Joseph Smith, would look into a stone and see these nefarious beings, twisted and turned and bloody and haunted, trying to access. And Joseph, in his response and his measurement of trying to explain why the treasure was hid away, had to also suggest that this was a great act of violence. In his 1826 trial, Joseph explained that he was unable to get some treasure because when he looked into his seer stone, he saw that one Indian had murdered another Indian and been thrown into the dirt, into the hole that was created for the treasure, and this frightened him so much he could no longer look in his stone and recover the loot. This great violence was a barrier to retrieving treasure, and there are a number of people who identified this, including Lucy Mack Smith and Oliver Cowdery. This is Oliver Cowdery in 1835 trying to explain the acquisition of the plates. On attempting to take possession of the record, a shock was produced upon his system by an invisible power which deprived him in a measure of his natural strength. He desisted for an instant and then made another attempt, but was more sensibly shocked than before. What was the occasion of this he knew not. There was a pure, unsullied record, as he had been described. He had heard of the power of enchantments and 1,000 like stories which had held the hidden treasures of the earth, and supposed that physical exertion and personal strength was only necessary to enable him to yet obtain the object of his wish. He therefore made a third attempt with an increasing exertion. When his strength failed him more than at either of the former times, and without premeditation, he exclaimed, "Why can I not obtain this book?" "Because thou hast not kept the commandments of the Lord," answered a voice, which seemed a short distance. He looked, and to his astonishment there stood an angel who had previously given him the directions concerning this matter. Lucy Mack, in her 1845 account, talks about this also. Joseph, in the hour of excitement, was overcome by the powers of darkness and forgot the injunction that had been laid upon him. He had some further conversation with the angel at this interview, after which he was permitted to raise the stone again, and there he beheld the plates as before. He immediately reached forth his hand to take them, but instead of getting them as he expected, he was hurtled back upon the ground with great violence. When he recovered, the angel was gone, and he arose and returned to the house, weeping with grief and disappointment. There was a concerted, ongoing effort to change this treasure guardian, this haunted spirit, into an angel of light. This evolved to Moroni, who was the benevolent keeper of the record, who was changed into an angel who was guiding Joseph through the process of being able to realize his potential as a translator of this ancient people. So it was God directing him to this great work. Not that he had conjured an ancient spirit, a haunted guardian, whom directed him to the traffic, and which he overcame by obtaining the record. But this came only after the first 50 to 100 members of the church who had converted were from the same folk magic tradition, who believed in treasure seeking, who believed in these haunted spirits, who were guardian keepers of these treasures. And then this was morphed as the church moved from New York to Ohio. And angels became the Christian retelling of this acquisition. Another part of the acquisition of the treasure that morphed over time was the understanding that Joseph got right at the very beginning in 1823 that he needed to bring somebody with him. The Guardian said that he needed to bring his oldest brother, but soon after, Alvin suddenly died. This not only threw the Smith family into turmoil, but it also thwarted this whole endeavor that Joseph would acquire the treasure by being able to have the right person with him. But by 1827, and newly married, Joseph thought this might be his wife, Emma Hale. When family friends Josiah Stoll and Joseph Knight Sr. came to visit the Smith family in Manchester on the 21st of September, which was the equinox, Joseph and Emma dressed in black and stole away in their carriage to the Hill Cumorah. This was a rare moment of privacy for the couple, who lived in the frame house with the parents close by. Whether it was the opportunity of privacy or whether it was connected to the procedure of acquiring the treasure, we don't know, but Emma became pregnant that night. We know this because their baby was born on the 15th of June the next year, which is the exact gestation date for the 21st and 22nd of September 1827. Joseph reported the next day that he was successful in acquiring the plates, and this became a huge deal to the family. In fact, for the next several weeks, things were so busy because word went out to other treasure diggers that he had acquired the treasure that they had long sought, and many of them thought that they had an interest in this treasure dig because they had been colleagues. Strenuous efforts were made to try and get the treasure from the Smiths, and there is a number of accounts of them evading other treasure seekers as they sought to retain this prize for themselves. So strenuous were the efforts to acquire this treasure that Joseph and Emma ended up moving to Harmony, Pennsylvania, to her parents' place, and they were now reconciled after their elopement on the basis that Emma was pregnant. Somewhere in all of this, a new story emerged that got lost in the historical record, and that was that this child was really special. Joseph relayed to some people in Manchester that this child would be the special one who would be able to read the plates when he was very young. The Hales family in Harmony, Pennsylvania also related a number of tales that Joseph had said about this promised baby boy who would be some kind of oracle to be able to look at the plates and decipher the hieroglyphics. But on the 15th of June 1828, things ended in disaster. The newborn baby boy of Joseph and Emma died soon after birth. It's reported that they called him Alvin, after Joseph's older brother who had died suddenly. Joseph and Emma were bereft, but particularly this prophecy that Joseph had had about his son, that he would be the chosen one, was also in disarray, and he stopped talking about it. And probably a little bit more heartbreaking, this new child, which was to reconcile Joseph to his in-laws, just ended up being a little more on the outer. He continued with his project with regard to the Book of Mormon, which ostracized him from the family, and the Hales got progressively worried about the endeavor and tried to distance themselves, even to the point of almost evicting the Smiths from a little farmlet that they had nearby. Joseph's folk magic and treasure-seeking culture affected some of the stories that were being circulated, and real life stepped in and changed some of those trajectories of those stories quite significantly. Joseph learnt to pivot quickly in the moment when the things that he anticipated did not happen quite as he wanted. And so new stories were created to obscure past failures, but also to promote new beginnings and hopes. Only the Bear has a great question, which I think is worthy of some fleshing out. So what are your thoughts about Joseph actually having plates? Seems odd that he made such a big fuss over the plates if they weren't real. The big thing to really consider is that with folk magic, the plates did not have to be real. Treasure is something that Joseph could have seen in his seer stone and been completely immersed in the idea that it was real and it was just going to come to pass over time. He could will them into existence. By the middle of the 1830s, there's an intricate story about the acquisition of the plates. But prior to this, there's a whole lot of other evidence that suggests something quite different. For instance, on the 22nd of September, after going to the Hill Cumorah, Joseph did not bring the plates home. He brought home something wrapped in a cloth, some form of spectacles, which his mother attested to, but not the plates. Joseph waited till a box could be made that could secure whatever it was that he had. And nobody was allowed to look in the box upon penalty of death. And in the folk magic tradition, Joseph had been trying to acquire these for years. The family were on high alert that things they needed to do properly, to do exactly. And if they did anything differently, like peek, they could thwart the whole business. Lucy Mack tells the story that the box was in danger of discovery, and so Emma rode to where Joseph was working to ask him to come back. He took his seer stone out and placed it in the hat and was able to remote view the plates and determine that they were safe. When the couple moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania, Isaac Hale recounts that Joseph bought a box to which he was not allowed to look inside, in which case Isaac said that he had to remove it, and he put it in the woods where it stayed hidden for the entire time. The plates were not viewed and not necessary for the whole translation process with Martin Harris in 1828. Isaac Hale recounts that Isaac came back in March of 1829 demanding to see the plates, and that Joseph told him that he was not supposed to show them, but if he walked out into the forest and Martin followed his footsteps, that maybe if the Lord was gracious, he would give him a sight of the plates, which in which case never happened. And then we get Doctrine and Covenants section 5 that basically says Martin is not allowed to see the plates, and the world has been kept from the plates, and Joseph is the only one to take care of that. Oliver Cowdery, as scribe, never got to see the plates during the translation process. Emma Smith never sees the plates. She's told in Doctrine and Covenants section 25 that she's not to murmur because she's not called as a witness. And Joseph and Oliver don't take the plates from Harmony, Pennsylvania to Fayette, New York when they move at the beginning of June 1829. Doctrine and Covenants section 7 suggests that Joseph can remote view, and he does so by seeing a parchment of John's in the Old World and being able to translate that. This is how the whole Book of Mormon is done. And this is why the Whitmers don't, protest when they get to Fayette, that Joseph is looking at a stone in his hat and remote viewing the plates wherever they might be in the world. The three witnesses don't even have to see physical plates. They can see them in their mind's eye because they're all from that same treasure-digging folk magic world. Oliver Cowdery has a divining rod. Martin Harris has visions. David Whitmer has seer stone. They could all just see it in their mind's eye. The 8 witnesses seem to come across something more tangible, but the witness statement talks about hefting the plates, which could just be the box. Later testimony in 1838 suggests that they signed their name to something that they weren't quite happy with, and other testimony seems to indicate that they might have seen the plates in their mind's eye inside the box, which they were able to heft. Even Doctrine and Covenants section 17, which is the command by God to the three witnesses to testify to what they are seeing, suggests that they should see the plates like Joseph has seen the plates, and this could well be just in their mind's eye. Now, I think that Joseph probably engineered some kind of prop, but he didn't really need to, and maybe he didn't. That this is just folk magic culture making the plates real because people could understand it through the same kind of Dungeons and Dragons imagination, world building understanding of folk magic culture. And by tossing that imagination again and again and recalling it, you can make something real in your mind, because your brain doesn't know the difference between reality and what you tell it repeatedly. The plates, in essence, become tangible over time as the story repeats, as people buy into it, as they imagine that these are real artifacts. But the only artifact we have of this whole process is Joseph's brown, egg-shaped seer stone, and the text of the Book of Mormon that was produced by putting that stone in a hat. Cameron asks this really great question in relation to all that we've just talked about. Do you believe Joseph believes his own stories? My best guess would be yes and. This is not just Joseph Smith's nice thing to believe. This is his world. His father has dreams and visions, uses a dowsing rod, and has a seer stone. And his mother is a healer. She can take these great arts and fix the family. His older brother Alvin, who works alongside his dad, is also a treasure digger. They are New England refugees in Western New York, surrounded by other New England refugees in Western New York. His neighbors have seer stones. They go on treasure digs. This is just the way that his world operates. He is eager to learn as much as he possibly can, and he's eager to support the family in this very important part of their cultural identity, but also their economic activity. He wants to be inducted into the highest offices of this particular cultural nuance. He wants to be the person in charge. He wants to take over from his father the family business. He wants to provide the reliability that his father can't. And he has a gift for telling stories, for being able to see and to have a vision of things that are special and important, and be able to impart that to people with their motivation intact. In fact, they follow him, they invest in his stories, they give him resources, they provide for his family. He is just enamored by this gift and believes that it comes from something divine. As he works these rituals, he gets some form of success. People believe in him. They have a great feeling. They see things that they impart to him. He's able to tell them of things that they feel incredibly attached to. All of these things provide to Joseph that what he's seeing is real. It's an understanding. It's a feeling. It's a deep down gut, recognition of what was really happening behind the scenes. This is a religion in its own right, and it's woven with Christian understanding and dogma alongside. Now, there are people in his community that are making a distinction, and especially when he goes to the Hale farm and his extended family on Emma's side is really not investing in his stories, does he doubt? But he is also heavily invested in bringing something forth that will validate his position and his prowess. Does he take some shortcuts? Does he invent some evidence? Does he promote something that he knows is a little suspect? Absolutely. But this is part of the pathway to belief and to acquire what it is that he really needs. This is what all heroes do. They manifest their belief into reality. There is certainly some justification that the ends justify the means. Yes, there is some ends justify the means, but when things do work out, it validates that the seer is actually doing what he's supposed to be doing, that he's being commanded or rewarded or validated in the fact that it is the right thing to do. And so these become witnesses that he is on the right track. And when it doesn't work out or he's challenged, this provides a pivot to learn, to grow, to hone skills, and to try again. He wants to believe. Many of the people around him also want to believe. And so together they create something which feels very tangible, which feels real and successful and beautiful and inspiring. And they work with that to its logical conclusion, which is this is what is supposed to happen. The imaginary becomes real. And now there's a whole church to prove it. And back then, there was the written text of the Book of Mormon to substantiate this great understanding from outside the veil.